Let me.
You need to unmute, Paul.
I think I've got myself unmuted now, finally,
Yes.
but the slideshow isn't up yet. So let me try that again.
It is up, Paul.
We do have the slideshow working.
Yeah, I see Brent Larson.
Very
A
good.
beautiful wedding picture, it looks like.
That's what we have. He will look a little bit older for us now, but this is the picture that he sent. And I think, given a beautiful bride like that, I understand why he would send it. Just has to help offset for us ugly guys the demonstration of the beautiful ladies that get attracted to us is one of the major offsetting factors in life. I don't really need to introduce Brent in some respects because he's been with us for a number of weeks as a participant, but this is the first time for him to offer a presentation, and he has volunteered to address the translation strategies and processes by assorted modern translators. He comes from the LDS tradition. He teaches a primary class in his St. Louis ward. He carries a BS in computer information, and so at the outset was working on screen sharing and coming up with multiple options on his 3 sets. But he regularly watches the Gospel Tangents with Rick Bennett, and then he has volunteered to share his information this evening. And so we welcome you, Brent, and let us invite the Lord to join us in our sharing and our presentation. So let us pray together. And the building in the background is the back of the Joseph Smith Historic Site, and you're seeing the feature 2 squares being laid out here. You'll later see people that are working there. But let us pray. Originator of the word, its components, the ideas behind each, the author of all existence. We bow in appreciation of the tiny amount of your creation we can apprehend or even acknowledge and find relevant to ourselves, typically with your assistance. This evening, we ask your blessing on Brent Larson, our presenter, who has been looking at the translation process. And we want to understand commonalities and differences among translators in our effort to assess. We struggle to understand ourselves, each other, our world, and especially you. And we seek to find the commonalities among us in creation, in all the things you do. And as we bridge from one language to another, often confused in communicating even with a brother, we recognize our meanings placed in words may not suffice, especially when we attempt to understand the massive efforts of your hand to give us grace by your Son's sacrifice. So from our world of turmoil, spring growth erupting from the soil, we turn to you in gratitude that you bless. Even though we act in spite of what we know, in harshness, not in love, we like to confess, resulting in our need to learn a new language, to succeed in relationships in which peace can hold its stance. For we find our efforts pale. Most frequently, they fail when we proceed without your divine assistance. So bless us in the name of the Christ, the translator of mortality into immortality. Amen. I will stop sharing, and Brent, the floor is yours. You're welcome to screen share, and if you'd like to invite people to interrupt, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, we'll expect to let you present, and we'll come with our questions and answers afterwards.
So I would like to apologize in advance for all of the interruptions that are going to occur over the next little while. So let's get started. So
Excuse me, Brent, but there is no need to apologize for kids that are growing and thriving.
gotcha. Did that share or no?
We're not seeing you yet.
We're seeing it says you've started sharing.
I think you need to try the screen share again. There it comes.
I'm not seeing Brent. Did he mute himself?
Is that better?
Yes.
There, I hear you. Yep.
Okay. So, okay. And can you see my screen that I'm presenting?
The
Yes.
phenomenon of translation of ancient records.
Yep. Okay, good. We're in business. So there is a phenomenon going on around us, and it has been happening since, well, maybe since the dawn of time, but I'm going to follow it starting around 1830. Or, so here's what we're doing. There are various modern accounts of prophets that have brought forth ancient records, similar to what we see from Joseph Smith. So we're going to talk about what all is going on, and so that we can look at what are the commonalities and things, so that we can have conversations about how does that unfold the translation of the Book of Mormon, because it's a similar phenomenon, right? We want to bring new life to the old discussion. And so the advantage that we have right now is that many of these people are still alive. And so with the historical record, all we can do is look back, and finding new information is slow and tedious. And then it includes all kinds of discussion and consensus, and then different people jump into different camps. Whereas right now we can just go and talk to these people that are doing it today. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's what Joseph did, but it does give us some insight into what may have happened. And so I think it'll make for an interesting discussion. So the objectives, the non-objectives, we're not here to decide whether or not we believe that this is from God in each case, or in any of the cases, or in all of the cases. We're not trying to reframe them in a way that is what we would hope they would be, or anything else. We're just going to take what they say they are, similar to what we take when we give someone the Book of Mormon, and we say, these are the circumstances of its coming forth, and take it or leave it. Right? So we will take each record at its word, that it is what it says it is, for the sake of discussion. So I'm going to present a summary of nearly a dozen example translation situations. And then after each one, I'm going to stop and pause and allow for some questions about that particular translation. And so given the amount of time, that should be targeted entirely at just understand. The questions should be targeted at just understanding what it was that they say they did, so that when we get to the discussion phase, we have more information to work with, right? Then after step one there, we're going to move on to questions, because I've heard on this forum different speculations about what was going on 200 years ago. And people have questions that they like to entertain. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pose some of those same questions, and we're going to include the feedback from these other accounts as part of the discussion. And then we'll open up each of those discussions for people to comment on. And then, assuming that we haven't way overspent our time, we're going to just open the floor for any sort of questions and discussions that people want to have. All right. So that's my plan for the presentation. So step one. Let's start where we all are familiar. this will give you a feel for what I'm going to be presenting about each of the cases. So this is the Book of Mormon. It is translated by Joseph Smith in 1830. As a source record, he had physical gold plates. And I don't think that this is in the historical record, but according to other people who have seen these plates, there are 68 plates that he translated from the stack. It was bound by rings, and then it had this sealed portion that was like 2/3 of the record. Right? The way that he translated for the first 116 pages that we believe is the Book of Lehi, he used the Urim and Thummim, or at least that's the way it's described. Now, what does that mean? Well, probably that means that there was this breastplate that had a Urim and Thummim like glasses attached, and he would lean into it and look at the record and he could read. Now, for the rest of the book, perhaps the Urim and Thummim, or perhaps some have said that he put a stone in a hat and he just put his head in the hat, and from the stone he could see the gold plates and understand what they said. So that depends on who you ask. But so the actual distinction of what is reality there, I'm not too worried about, because you guys are all either familiar or know how to become more familiar with those. And so I'm just presenting it so that we're on the same page. Now, he had scribes. He would dictate and the scribe would record, which means that the scribes have the ability to add punctuation and things. They may have controlled some of the spelling. They may have, for all we know, they may have corrected grammar as it was coming out. They may have been like, yeah, we're going to fix that. We don't really know. But we assume that it is pretty much dictated out and written down. So he did this from April to June in 1829, so in about 3 months. And he produced 633 pages. And you guys are probably wondering which copy of the Book of Mormon is 633 pages, because that is, so I have all of these records on my computer, and I have extracted all the text. And when I print them off using exactly the same font and margins and stuff, I get 633 pages for this particular book as compared to the other books. And so the page numbers is not how many is their record. When I tell you how many page numbers that is, that's to compare against each other, apples to apples. How big is this record, right? So the Book of Mormon is 633 pages by my count. According to this replica, it was 589 pages. So, yeah. And it was published in 1830. So inside of the Book of Mormon, we have a record of 2 civilizations. We have the Nephites and the Jaredites. The Nephites were for like 1,000 years, from 600 BC to 420 AD. And the Jaredites start at the Tower of Babel and go to maybe 250 BC, depending on who's estimating. Okay. So now I would open it up for questions right now, except we're not going to open it up for questions on the Book of Mormon. We'll open it up for questions on the other ones. Fair? Good. So the Book of the Law of the Lord is the next example that I'm aware of. This is translated by James Strang. It's actually kind of, I'm counting 2 different things that he translated. One of them published in 1845 and one 1851. So the Vori plates were like little brass plates that are like index card or even business card sized. And there were 3 of them. And then the Book of the Law of the Lord was a little later, and it was 18 physical brass plates that were like 7 by 9 inches, which is about this size. And this is my copy of the Book of the Law of the Lord, right? But that's 7 by 9. As far as his translation method, I am not aware of any record, and I am prepared to open the floor to anybody who comes through this branch of the restoration who feels that they can describe, but I'll wait till the end of this record and will. But so, were there scribes? How is it described? But the Vori plates, the little one, was translated in less than a month. It was in September, and it was published that same year, and it ends up being 1 page by my count. The Book of the Law of the Lord was published in 1851, and it's 42 pages. And for those of you that are familiar with the Book of the Law of the Lord, it is some translated sections and then lots of prophetic commentary from the translator that was added in future publications. And so those 42 pages do not include the additional commentary that I think should be treated as part of the record, because it's like the framing around the picture. If the plates are presenting a picture of history, this is the picture frame, and it's a prophetic picture frame. So I think that it should be considered with the work, but I don't consider it part of the translation. Right? So 42 pages. And then what do they contain? The Vori plates, the little ones, they contain a very small record of the final days of a civilization. They contain a prophecy of a seer who's going to find and translate their record. And we don't really know when their civilization was. We just know it was before the 1800s, right? Probably long before that. And then the Book of the Law of the Lord, it contains excerpts from the plates of brass, which we assume, I think he says, these are the plates of brass like what the Book of Mormon speaks about when they talk about the plates of brass. It's not all of them, it's 18 of the plates of brass. And it includes things like the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and it's kind of a longer, more verbose version of the Ten Commandments than what you would get in like Exodus. It has lots of passages that are similar to what we receive in Deuteronomy and some other stuff, right? That's the Book of the Law of the Lord. Now, is there anybody who knows more about the translation method that wants to take the floor for a few minutes and tell us what they know? Because I'd love to know. Okay, take that as a no. All right, so the next one that I want to talk about is called the Songs of Zion. Do we have any people from the William Bickerton branch of the Restoration here with us today? Okay, well, so this comes through there. They are the, I mean, this is the way that I view them. I don't know how they feel about it, but they are the Pentecostal Mormons, right? So they are of the group who believe that if you have the mic, you have the meeting, and let the Spirit guide, right? So Arlene Buffington received a hymn book, one hymn at a time, by, well, I'll get to that. So there were no plates involved here, and there's not really a record. But I do feel like she's drawing on songs that exist that weren't her writing them, if that's fair. So it's kind of similar to ancient record translation, where you're receiving a thing that you aren't the author. But so she would just stand up in meetings and like gift of tongue style would sing. And she's not a poet, she's not a musician, she's not a singer, but she was willing to just stand up and let it out. And then, since she's not a musician, she would sit down with a scribe and she would kind of sing what she hears, and they would work it out on the piano until the person who was scribing for her understood what was going on, and then they would put it down in meter and put the lyrics on it, and that was the scribe process. So this happened over the course of 40 years, starting in 1977, and it was first published in 1980, but there's been multiple publications since then. At the time that she died, just a couple of years ago, there were 239 songs, and they're printed in the Songs of Zion. This is a book that you can get if you can figure out how to get them to send you one. And if you do, let me know how you did it, because they're usually out of print. And so they always tell me when I say, hey, send me one of those, they're always like, in our next printing, you can get that. So it's out there, I promise. And there's a website that has them all, so you can find these songs and you can listen to them. They have them online. Like, they're not hard to find. They're just, it's hard to have a physical copy, but they're neat. Oh, any thoughts on the Songs of Zion before we move on? And by thoughts, I mean questions that I might be able to answer, not, we'll saving the opinion thought to the very, very end.
Was it good music in your observation?
I enjoyed it very much. It feels very 1980s primary, which is my favorite time for primary songs. They're not necessarily primary feeling songs, but they are the sorts of songs that I would sing with a primary group, and I think they would enjoy them. And they're also fitting for meetings with more than kids. But yeah, they're very pleasant.
I was thinking that so in Community of Christ, our first hymnals were composed by Mother Emma Smith, and she, like, knowing what her background is and like in the restoration, but also like in like also Methodism and Methodist Episcopalianism, however you would say it. I used to be from it, so I don't know why I had trouble saying it. But she was a person with priesthood, and not, it's not necessarily necessary to add, but it adds a bit of like, so it adds some. I'm making a parallel to being a prophet, seer, and revelator, because in Community of Christ, the hymnal is considered by a lot of people as like the fourth book of scripture, because the songs inform that has how you teach the theology. And so I was wondering if you know, I would assume what effects the Song of Zion has on what their theology is.
So that is an interesting question, because some of these songs are about going to Zion and covered wagons and things, which is not a part of that particular branch of the restoration. They were not cross the plains Mormons. They were in Kansas. Now I think their big stronghold now is out in California. I think, I don't really know, but they're not the Mormon pioneers. But yet it's about Zion, and it's about, and not all of them, but a couple of the songs are actually about covered wagons and stuff. So it's an interesting record, or I don't know what you would call it, but I think of it like I do the other translations, because it's received, and it was a thing that she didn't write. She was more the receiver, and she didn't even write it down. There was a scribe, which seems to be a pattern, not in all of them.
I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I was assuming that this was a kind of hymnal.
It is a hymnal, but it's all revealed hymns, not
No, like a hymnal of
elected.
of the church, and instead of a hymnal of the member of the church.
Yeah, it's put together by her, and I believe that branch does have that in the pews. Because when
Okay,
I tried
awesome.
to
That's
order
what I
them,
wanted to know.
yeah,
Thanks.
when I tried to order them, they're like, well, the ones that we just printed, they're for this congregation over here, right? And so there go all of them. But
Isn't this the group that is in headquartered near Pittsburgh?
Monongahela is the headquarters for
Yeah.
this branch.
And
We've
do
had
don't-
Josh Gailey has been the representative who's presented several times with us and participated significantly, and he does indicate that the songs of Zion, there are something that they informally at least consider to be scriptural.
do they share with everybody else the idea that the temple lot is a place that's going to have a temple erected on it? I mean, they're Sidney Rigdon was with the church still, I think, at that time. So, and he's their linkage back in. So I'm just wondering if they might not have the idea of going from Monongahela to Missouri in wagons, just like Mormons go from Salt Lake, or you know, that's what I'm asking about.
right.
Well, the fact that they have membership in, I think, 82 countries, and they are the third largest of the restoration movement, means that they are a worldwide organization as well. And so I would hesitate. I don't think that the count of the wagons would, I think it's simply a reflection of Arlene Buffington upon the overall history of the movement, not something projected to the future.
Well, when I was young, we talked about going in wagons back to Missouri. People don't talk about that anymore. So that was a part of our culture in the 50s, the 60s, maybe up into the 80s when these were written, apparently. But that
That's
is
interesting.
that isn't really part of LDS culture, I don't think.
Interesting comparison. Thank you.
Okay, so then the next one that I'd like to highlight is the writings of Moroni. And these are received by Hava Pratt in 1980. She also did not have physical plates. So she heard the voice of Moroni as a roaring in her ears, and she did that while she's out like hanging laundry. And then she would go in and write down what she heard. So she had no scribe. And it's kind of more like revelation than translation, because she's not looking at anything. She's not grappling with an ancient language. But I put it in here because she's receiving a record that's not her authorship. And it's not really a thus saith the Lord revelation type of thing either. It's just the record is being given to her, and then she's responsible for writing it down for us. But so she received these in 1980, and she never really published them, but she did share them with friends and family. And so she shared them with a study group in like 1994. So there were some copies circulating. And then after she died, they've been published online, and they've found their way into like collections of scriptures. But she produced 38 pages that year while she was receiving them on a somewhat regular basis. And there goes the distractions I was talking about. So the description of what's in them, these include events from Moroni's life after the fall of the Nephites. Kind of him on the run and him learning the principles of like ascension, I guess is the best word for it. So it's an interesting read. It doesn't take that long to read, and it's worth your time. Oh, any questions on that one before we jump to the next one?
Is Sister Pratt related to the other members of the Pratt family in some way?
She is. She descends from a cousin of Orson and Parley's, whose name starts with an A, and I don't remember it.
Addison?
Addison. I believe that's her line.
Yeah.
So she was what you would call, I guess, Brighamite LDS at the time. I don't know that she was when she died. I think she was part of a fundamentalist group for a little while. I don't really know her history that well. I wish I did. I should look into that because I'm curious to know. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next one. Okay, so the next one is the Ayat Kuyat Nemenha. And this is brought to us by Dr. Philip Landis. He started receiving in 2000. It's this gigantic book. His source record was many little stamp-sized plates that are kind of like, I want to say, miniature microfiche of the original record, somehow etched into metal on a tiny scale. So he has been to the place where he saw them, where they're stored in the Manti area, and he got to touch the ones that were his family's, but he did not take them out of that vault, and he didn't have them when he was translating. Right? So that's our source record that we're dealing with. And then, so I don't think he uses any sort of seer stone. But so he uses a form of meditation that he calls walking on the way. So he will prepare himself to go into this meditation. He'll be invited across the veil, basically. And then from there, he can look at these records and he understands what they say. And the author is oftentimes there with him, talking to him about what they say. And so when he's not sure what it means, he'll ask them, and maybe they'll tell a story of what happened, or they'll help him understand it. But it's none of it's English, and it's not English when he's talking to them. And he just understands what they were saying, and then he'll come back after the meditation and sit down and write out what he learned and what it said. And that's the way that the translation happened. So he didn't have any scribes, but they do have a translation council where there's 3 or 4 people that are participating, and they'll each do translation work, and then they'll get together on the way, even though one of them's in Asia and one of them's in South America. They get together in meditation and discuss what is being presented and whether or not they agree on the way that the other people are receiving the record. It's the most bizarre phenomenon I've ever heard, and I would be curious to observe that. But so that's the way that they do, but they don't have scribes. They just go back and write it themselves. So his translation has been 20 years in the making, starting around 2000. So he first published some of it in 2004. He's done 2 or 3 publications since, and the latest one that's pretty much the end of it was in 2022, and it's 1,200 pages by my scheme for pages. He does say that there's more, but it's not the records. It's like there's a herbology book that was written by one of the people who wrote a record. She also wrote this plant taxonomy book that he's wanting to translate, but that he's more worried about how you present it, because the way that she recorded it is not really the way that we would consume it. And so they're back and forth about what's the best way to release it. But anyway, so there's more, which is another of the themes, is that they all say there's more where this came from. That's a very common statement that they all seem to make. So the description, this starts right after the Captain Moroni Wars in the Book of Mormon. Haggoth sails northward, and from him, the ancestral line of Dr. Landis moves all over North America at one point in time or another, until a few generations before Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. So the record contains writings from people up to about 1600 AD. And that is what is in this record. So any questions on that before we jump to the next person?
Brett, on these platelets, are they ancient metal or modern plastic or somewhere in between?
They are metal that has been pressed thin like a stamp and small. And he actually sets them, if you were going to use it in a non-meditation, there's a contraption that you can set them on that makes it easier to see them blown up, kind of like we do in a microfiche library, where you can set it on a thing and scroll around and look at them.
I was curious about the kind of metal.
I don't know. I think copperish. But
Thank you.
it would need to be something that doesn't corrode, but I don't know.
Brent, could you explain to us the gap between 1600 and Chief Joseph?
So from there are 2 or 3 generations, but they didn't record, or if they did, they didn't put them into that library, I guess. But so there's a prophecy toward the end about Chief Joseph, and it makes a big deal about how his name is 7 syllables because it's the 7 voices of thunder, and that basically it prophesies that Chief Joseph is a prophet, and that he's part of what's going on through the world. And that is, from what I understand, that's Dr. Landis's, his daughter, adoptive daughter, is Philip's grandmother.
Is this largely historical, or does it contain some theology and teachings about Christ?
It is as theological as the Book of Mormon and as historical as the Book of Mormon. in its character.
The parts of the book that overlap time-wise with the Book of Mormon, does it have basically the same timeline, the same story, the coming of Christ,
Yes.
period of peace, and then the fall of the Nephites, or is it very different as far as the account of the history?
It is the same. The beginning of the book, they maintain a correspondence with the Nephite nation, even though they consider themselves a separate nation. And then as things after the end of Zion within the Nephite world, that as they're observing the Nephites begin to fall, they cut ties and kind of fade into the north and avoid anything. They try to whisper themselves away, really. And so that's why, so their main records are in Manti, and the value of that is that there's this difficult terrain to cross, so you're not going to be influenced by people in the land southward. But so for the part where they are interacting, they're back and forth with Shiblon and Helaman, and it is very definitely the same record. And they send missionaries to the cities that, when the Lord in 3rd Nephi, when the Lord lists out cities that are being destroyed because they rejected the prophets, this has stories of the prophets who visited those cities and their rejections, this kind of thing. So it very definitely fits for those early phases. It's almost written like it was written by somebody who knew what was in the Book of Mormon, which I guess is easy to do if you grew up in the church. But so it starts off that way, and then it transitions very interestingly into a group with councils and with people who try to have relatively small cities that can kind of move around. It's a very gradual, and it's a compelling record. I very much enjoy reading it.
Do they maintain or do they allege any connection with actually existing Native American groups? I mean, is this supposedly a history of the Ute Native Americans or any of the other groups that live in the Great Basin area? Recognized real Native American tribes who live in the Great Basin area, since if this is all centered around Manti, I assume,
Yeah.
that would be the geography that you would look to.
You would, so they connect to the Nez Perce, or at least Philip Landis comes through that, his line comes through that tribe. So when I'm going to go ahead and tell a little bit of his story, even though that's not where I was going, just because it seems to be where the interest is. So he went on an LDS mission, came home very sick, had kind of a faith crisis where he's like, well, what do you want me to do? And since he's about a fourth Native American, he decided he wanted to go on a vision quest. And so he started asking the different natives in the area for one of them that was willing to entertain his desire to do that. And so a couple of Navajos kind of laughed at him and said, sure, we'll help you do that. And they went and just like dumped him in the desert. And well, I guess they set him on the path. He just didn't know what path he was expecting to do. But so he did experience what you would call a vision quest. And he spoke with one of his ancestors who told him, we've got some things that we want you to do. So, and that was way early on. And then ultimately that kind of unfolded. There is not a tribe that claims him, but there is a tribe that he claims, if that's fair.
Okay. And is he still with us? Is he still alive?
Yep.
And does he have much of a following? Did he create a little church? Or, I mean, you mentioned that there were a committee that would analyze his translations and stuff. I mean, are there many people who are affiliated with this?
There is a group in kind of southwestern Missouri where he has some property where they're cultivating it and like teaching permaculture and stuff. He's not trying to build a church per se. He's trying to make the book available and he's trying to guide people who have questions, but he doesn't feel called to be at church. So he's not. There's maybe a few dozen people that I know of that are regularly interacting with this group and not just have read about it and think it's interesting.
The
Okay,
geog-
those are my questions.
the geography of Manti. Is it clear that it's tied to Utah or to Manti in Mexico or otherwise?
Well, so Manti is one of the places where the record is, but it jumps all the way up to like Quebec and over into California, depending on the time period, and into down into Missouri, and even I think the Smoky Mountains, because a lot of it's just by description. But if you know the geography, you can kind of follow the description a lot of times. But it's all over the United States, but it doesn't claim to be like a nationwide council. There were times when it was large and had a large coverage, and there are times when it was small and had lots of little. And his family, for the early parts, is in Manti, and they move up into Idaho area, and they move down to Missouri area. They move so they kind of moved around.
So the Manti would be the one in Utah.
Yeah, and that's the main one because that's where the vault is, where things are stored, because that's the safest. That's the place where they felt if they needed to defend themselves, you can. I don't know if you've been to San Pete, but it's a pretty defendable valley.
Thank you.
All right. So the next one is the Ang Akeltan. And this is brought to us by Elijah Enoch in 2007. So these were from copper plates. Elijah says that he went to the cave where the plates were stored, but wasn't allowed to go in. And so he did not have the plates when he was translating, but he did see and vision where they were, so that he went to the site, saw that there was a place there that looked like the vision, and said, okay, I'm on board. This is in the Philippines where this cave is. So he didn't use a seer stone or anything else that I know of that was a physical translation tool. He would translate by going to sleep at night, and in his dream, he would go into that cave and he would look at the plates, and he would look at symbols and let them tell him what they meant. And then he would confirm whether or not the meaning that the characters were letting him understand were what the Lord intended for him. And so then in the cave, still in his dream, he would write down what they said. And then when he woke up, he would go get a journal and write down what he had written in his dream. And he did that so there's no scribe. And he did that over the course of 8 months and produced 165 pages worth of Filipino record, or from that area. I don't know that it's Filipino, but it's that area of the world record. And he published it in 2007, but he actually started that in 1987 and was told to hold on to it for 20 years and release it later. And he's like, okay, works for me. So this is a group of people who, based on the text, seem to be Levites, although I don't think it ever says that they're descendants of Levi, but they came from Israel, and they were pretty Levite in the way that they did things. And the record goes from the 2nd century BC until the 10th, but it starts kind of mid-civilization with a man who's kind of brought into the call by his grandfather. And it doesn't include a book by his grandfather, and we don't know how many generations there were from when they left. But in my mind, they're part of the Daniel Babylon spreading branch. That's what makes the most sense to me. And then some of them went all the way to the Philippine Islands, stayed there, and over time, there was the civilization that built up, and there was this line of prophets who were trying to hold the old tradition, and it starts with one of them in the 2nd century. And it goes until about the 10th century, and then they close it up because it's no longer safe to actively produce the record. All right. Any questions or thoughts on that one?
The name is pronounced Enoch.
Yeah, I believe so. All right, I'm going to keep rolling because we got a bunch of these. Okay, so the Chronicles of the Children of Aaronic. This is by Matthew Gill. Some of it was published in 2007, some of it is in 2015. He has a Gospel Tangents interview if anybody's curious. Actually, like 3 or 4 of them. Well, 3 or 4 episodes. He brought forth the book of Jeranek that was based on 24 brass plates that are the same basic 7x9-ish that a lot of these are. Another book that he got at the same time, but there were different shaped plates, like of different dimensions. And that's the book of the religious practices of the people, or of the children of the light, or something like that. And then later he brought forth the book of Raanek, which was a physical book, like you and I think of a book, but the pages were not paper. They were more like, I don't know what, a much more durable, almost plastic-like, a rough, matte plastic. I don't know. But one of the witnesses who got to hold the book and was playing with it, when she was describing it, she said that she was expecting the paper to be very different based on the descriptions than what she felt. It was just not the same. So I guess it's hard to describe. But so the translation method for Matthew is that in the beginning of the book, it says that it's translated by way of the Urim and Thummim. But in interviews, you'll see that he very much prefers to just call them interpreters or translators. I believe that after he released them, he realized that he doesn't necessarily believe that this is the Urim and Thummim that Joseph Smith had. And he really doesn't know what makes a translator object the Urim and Thummim. And so he's kind of shied away from saying it was translated by the Urim and Thummim. At least that's what I gather, because it says it in the book, and then doesn't seem to be as committed to that. But so to him, his translators were kind of large, one red and one blue translucent stones that you would use like a monocle, except you use them at the same time, but they're not attached. So, and they're larger than, like, you'd be owl-eyed if you held them up to your face. They're like too big for glasses. But so when he's looking at the plates or the book through them, he can read it's English. I don't know if it's English on top of or next to the original, or if he just sees it English. But so the book of Raanek, he said, was it more difficult to translate? It took a lot longer, and he produced a lot fewer pages. But he doesn't really give a description of what made it more difficult, because I would think if you're just reading it like a book, it should be just as difficult as the other one. And so he did have scribes. So here's how this worked. He would sit on the edge of the kitchen table at his father's house, and he had 2 scribes, and one of them would sit on the 2 edges on either side of his side of the table. And then he would read, and they would both write. And then after that session was over, they would sit down and compare notes and make one copy. And then that was the copy. When they all agreed, that's what we did. And if they couldn't agree on what it was supposed to look like, they'd go back and read until they got to that spot, read it, and they'd put it in there. So that's how they did their translation. And so this happened, the book of Jeranek and the religious practices, I don't remember the whole title, it's long, was about 3 months in 2006, from October to December. He published it in 2007, and it's 116 pages, which is not the same as the 116 pages, or the 116 pages. It just happens to be that big. And then the book of Raanek was done over several months and is only 68 pages, and it came to us in 2015. And they're published together by him in one volume called the Chronicles of the Children of Aramaic, because these are both prophets who were descendants of that initial prophet. So Aramaic would have been like their Lehi, and then these are like Mormon and Moroni. That's fair. And so this is a history of the former inhabitants of the British Isles. So Matthew's from there. He lives in Derbyshire. It starts in the Tower of Babel area, at the Tower of Babel, and then they travel north and then across Europe, and then they jump into, well, they don't jump into the water, they build boats and they cross and go up into the area that is now where Stonehenge is, and that's kind of their home base. And the record goes from that early civilization up until the 1st century AD, when they're wiped out by what's essentially their Lamanite brothers, except they're not Lamanites, they're from Lamek. They're his descendants. So that's that book. Any questions about that one? Okay, I'm gonna keep jumping. So then we have the testimony of St. John as revealed through Denver Snuffer. So this happened in 2017. This is in his Teachings of Commandments. It's one of their branches. No. This is their Doctrine and Covenants, I guess. They call it the Teachings and Commandments. And it's a section, but it's not a revealed section like sections of the Doctrine and Covenants generally are in Mormon traditions. It is a translation. Not right now. Come on, please. Not right now. No. Not right now.
But what if you forget?
Oh, go. Okay, so the Lord tells Denver Snuffer that the book of John, the testimony of St. John as received through history, is insufficient for his purpose in the last days. And so he tells Denver that it is his job to bring forth a more complete translation, a more correct translation. And so Denver goes and finds some Greek manuscripts. I don't know where he gets them. He doesn't describe where he gets them, but he goes and gets the Greek. And he sits down, and I don't know how well he knows Greek or if he's doing this using grammar dictionaries and like learning Greek at the same time. But so at first he's doing this the old-fashioned way, and after a while, he goes back to the Lord and he explains that if it's okay with him, he would like to be no longer responsible for this because there's just no way he's ever going to finish it. And as he's translating, he doesn't feel like he's sure that he's any better than all these other translations. Like, so why would the Lord want him to do this? It's not working. And so then the Lord says, okay, I'm not going to let you off the hook on this, but I am willing to give you the gift of translation. And so he then uses the gift of translation. And I don't think he has a scribe, but he just, in a month, in 2017, he just translated the book of John. And he produced a 50-page book that is, this is not the same 50 pages as all the other ones. I don't have this one in my pre-formatted, drawn out. I think 50 pages is the size it is in his publication. But I think it's about roughly equivalent to the way that I'm counting pages. And it's a very interesting copy of the book of John. I mean, it's worth reading. It's a very interesting book. So yeah, it's a lot more wordy than what you and I normally get from John if we just sit down and read it from like King James. But other than that, it kind of follows the same basic structure, and it talks about a lot of the same things, and it's compelling. Any questions about how that one came? Okay. So then the sealed book of Mormon, well, it was originally published as the sealed book of Mormon, but then he was he was asked to remove the of Mormon if he wanted to continue to legally produce the book. So he did. But so this came to us by Mauricio Berger in 2018. This comes from the gold plates. This is a portion of the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. So he's the one that said that there were 68 plates that were from Joseph Smith. When he unsealed the next group, there were 42 plates that were unsealed, and then that lumped in with them, there are a continuing to be section of sealed plates. So there's actually 3 sets, the ones that Joseph translated, and then the 42 that Mauricio opened, and then more. So the record that he brought forth came from the first 20 or so of those 42 plates. So he also used the Urim and Thummim. He does believe that they are the Urim and Thummim even after the fact. It's not like Matthew where he's like, maybe these aren't. He believes that his are the Urim and Thummim. He used them like a prism because he speaks Portuguese, and he says that based on how he would use them, he could choose, do I want to see Portuguese or do I want to see English as he's translating? So he had 2 scribes, one of them who was a native English speaker and one of them who's a native Portuguese speaker, and they're both in the same room, and as he's translating, he would just kind of back and forth, and they would go kind of, I don't know, sentence by sentence or phrase by phrase, and he would just back and forth. That was the way they did that. So this took several months to do, starting in March 2018. I don't know when it ended, but I know that it was published in 2018, and it produced 132 pages. So now this is, well, it is not the writings of the brother of Jared, which is what we're all waiting for. He says that that is in the, I don't know if it's in the some of the ones that he did open but didn't translate, or if they're in the larger record at the bottom that is still sealed. But so this has several different things. It starts with Moroni giving some thoughts about what he's explaining, and then an abridgment by Mormon of some of the writings of Moses that has a lot of the same things that we receive from the Bible, but in the way that Mormon works, he's an abridger. It's going to be rephrased and kind of repacked. It also has a book that includes the writings of Jonas, the son of Timothy, one of the Lord's disciples, and he talks a fair amount on advising on how to bring forth Zion, and that's what this book is all about. Any thoughts before we move on?
And did he not publish the characters as well with a very similar picture to what brother?
There is a picture floating around. So there's controversy around this, and I'm going to give the most neutral telling of the controversy. So he was asked, what do the plates look like? And he wasn't yet comfortable sharing them. I mean, if you go online, you can see witnesses looking at them. But before that, he was asked, what do they look like? And he went online looking for pictures of gold plates and shared them and said, it's like this. And those that he said it was like were the Hoffman forgeries. And so erupt all whatever you want to say, you can be on either side of that, and you have all kinds of leverage as to how reasonable that is. But so he shared the Hoffman forgery as his, what does this look like, before he was willing to start showing people the actual plates. And so that's what's all over the place. Are there any other questions about this one before we jump on? Okay. So then we have the plates of brass, which have been brought forth by David Fairman, starting in 2018. So in this one, David goes into vision or into a meditative state, and he goes into a cave and sits down at a desk. And there's like, it's lit by fire, and the plates of brass are on the table. And so to his knowledge, there is no physical record that he can say, oh, this is in the plates of Komoro, or this is like, he's never held the physical thing and doesn't know where it is. He just knows where he has to go in his mind, in his meditative journey, where he has to go in order to be in this cave where there's this desk where he can read this record. So his method is he's mostly just reading it. So there's the plates, and of course it's Reformed Egyptian, and so you can look at them and it's Reformed Egyptian. And then if you want to know what they say, then Hebrew is written in fire, like a little bit above the Reformed Egyptian. As you're looking at a character, you can see what its Hebrew is. But so David doesn't know Hebrew, and so he'll ask the Lord, well, okay, what does this mean? And so then above that, he can see kind of English. And sometimes it's a word, the word, and sometimes it's you can kind of ask it if it has different meaning that's more applicable. Like it's a negotiation with the text, and while he is in meditation, he is also able to write it down in physical form without losing the meditation. And he just translates it onto the paper that is next to him, or into his word processor, or wherever he's recording. So he doesn't have a scribe, but he does occasionally discuss the translations with other people who offer suggestions and help him understand it. Because some of them, even though some of it, as you're reading it, it's fairly straightforward, and you just write it down and life is good. You'll get to a passage that's just more obscure, more difficult to Englishify, I guess. And so you have to negotiate with it. And sometimes the answer is, why don't you go look that up online and find out what that word means, and then you'll know. And then when you come back and read the rest of it, it will suddenly make sense and you'll be fine. So it's kind of a back and forth negotiation. So this has been going on since 2017, so for almost 7 years. The first publication of any of it was in 2018. It's been published ongoingly online, and it's currently 550 pages by my count. So it includes, and this is a quote from Nephi, but it includes the 5 books of Moses, the records of the Jews from the beginning, prophecies of the holy prophets, and a genealogy of Lehi's fathers. But so what does that really mean? So here's what is concrete in existence today. There's a title page fully translated, which is probably my favorite part of the book. Maybe not. There are the 5 books of Moses, which have been translated and published as a collection in one book. There is the first chapter of an account of the life of Adam and Eve. I think that's recorded by Joshua. There's the book of the Wars of Jehovah. The first 27 chapters are out there. There's the prophecy of Enoch. The first 4 chapters from that book are out there. There is the book of Melchizedek. Sefer is just Hebrew for book. The book of Melchizedek, the first 24 and a half chapters are out there. There is the record of Enoch. The first 5 chapters of that book are out there. There's the visions and parables of Zenos, and all 12 of those chapters are out there. And there is the declarations of Noon, and all 22 of those declarations are out there. And that, to me, the most fascinating thing about this list is how many books are partially available that are all unfolding at the same time. Because in the Joseph Smith translation, one of the things that people grapple with is, how was he following his own narrative? throughout time and keeping track of all of these things that are going on, and not tripping all over himself if it's coming from his mind. And in this record, we've got several different translations telling, some of them are existing stories, but some of them are things that we've never seen before, and they're all unfolding kind of in parallel depending on what the Lord directs David toward on that day. And it's a phenomenon to watch. It's a very interesting thing to engage with. But so do we have any questions about that? Now, I know David is here, and I'm gonna ask him to refrain from jumping in and answering questions yet, because I want to treat this record like all of the other ones, where you're getting it from a person who's researched it, kind of like we researched Joseph Smith. And so I do want to ultimately allow people to ask him the question, but I'd like to, before we get to the Q&A part, I'd like to keep this the same as all the other ones, if that's fair. So are there any questions about this record? Okay. So then this one's in there not because I considered it an inspired record of my own, but it's there for comparison so that we can draw on the differences. So I am fascinated by the Chinese sacred texts. And so the Tao Te Ching is one of my favorites. And so I decided I was going to translate it from its original Chinese, right? So I went to the internet and I downloaded a copy of these original ancient characters, and I printed it all out. And then I used online English Chinese dictionaries from the internet. And of course, I cheated and compared it to, there's a lot of translations of this book. And I would compare, try to get in the heads of the different translators. And then I would also look at the original characters and say, did they really say that? And so anyway, I would rework it. And this is the way that I knew that my translation was the true translation, is I would take each of the chapters, which I guess you could call a verse because it's a big poem. I would take each of the chapters and I would make sure that within itself, it had a consistent concept that it was teaching. Because if you just translate it word for word, it doesn't make any sense. But if you start to get in the head of the person who wrote it and figure out what they said, well, you can, once you start to see the commonality, you can make it make some sense. And so that was the way that I knew when I was on the right track, is it starts to actually make some sense. So I didn't have a scribe, and I would really just do a lot of pondering and the occasional aha moment where I'm like, oh, obviously that's what he was saying. And so that was my translation method. So it took me about 3 years. I never really published it. And I got about 30 pages worth of stuff. I did maybe a third of the overall record, which is not that long. It's only 81 poems total. But so this is the sacred text about the way and virtue. So the Tao Te Ching. It's from China, circa 600 BC. It's 81 separate little poems. And it explores the way that a virtuous king rules his subjects, and how that is the way that a sage rules his inner subjects. And it explores the behavior between the heaven and earth, and how a sage makes decisions that would be based on the observation of the balance between those two forces, because our decisions should be that balanced. And it explores the nature of the way, the path. And I think it's a fascinating book. It's worth a read. And you don't even have to read my translation if you don't want, because it's hard to find. All right. You guys are welcome to ask questions about that, but I don't expect you to be interested in my translation. So now we're going to shift over to part 2, where we're going to hit some of the questions that have come up in this forum, and we're going to explore how these different translators grappled with those same questions. So one of the things that we see, some people will argue that, or believe that, when Joseph was translating, the stone or the Urim and Thummim kind of dictated the words, and it was just Joseph's job to see or read or hear the words, say the words so that somebody would write them down. And to call it translation, since he doesn't know ancient languages, is he translating, right? That's one of the debates. So did Joseph see Reformed Egyptian and then comprehend meaning? And then did he compose the English himself after pondering and praying on it? Like it says in the Doctrine and Covenants. But behold, I say unto you that you must study it out in your mind, and then you shall ask me if it be right. And if it is right, I will cause you that your bosom shall burn within you. Therefore, you shall feel that it is right. That, I can't imagine that he did that on every single word. And if he did it phrase by phrase, then the way that Emma describes being a scribe is difficult to grapple with. Like it's so difficult with the historical record to recreate a thing that is exactly as described, right? And we still can't answer this question. Were the words just given to him, or did he have to understand and give the words themselves? But so here's some of the things that I found that relate to this question. So when Philip Landis was translating the Ayat Kuyat Nimenha, he doesn't get English at all, and he has to translate it into English. When Elijah Enoch translated the I can't pronounce it. So when he translated, he would see the symbols, he would come to individual words, but he had to put together the phrasing from the words, and then based on the context, he had to decide what does the sentence become when it's a sentence. So his is more like what I would think of as my translation process with Chinese, where I first figure out the words, then I figure out the groupings of words into ideas, and then I turn it into a structured sentence with some kind of meaning. So that seems to be what he was doing. So that's my, but when Hava Pratt was receiving, it was word for word. She would hear it, she would go home and write it. And it was audible, but it was dictated to her. With Matthew Gill, it seems to be almost entirely just reading it word for word. The translating device told him the words. Now, there were cases where he would be reading and the scribes would ask questions. And so he would stop and go back and ask the interpreters questions, and they would either give him a better translation, or they would, like he describes seeing a battle because he was asking what color, because it just says that they were wearing their color. And he was like, well, what color? And so he asked and watched the battle in vision and said, oh, their uniforms were red. And so then that's what's in the record. But mostly his is just straight out. He just read it in English through the interpreters. And with Mauricio Berger, it's kind of the same thing. He doesn't really describe the process that well, but it sure sounds like he's just giving phrases back and forth to his two scribes that he's getting through the Urim and Thummim. And he's not really massaging it much internally in his mind, but in something that you would call a translation process in his mind. He's getting it through the interpreters. Whereas with David Ferriman, he's seeing the plates of brass, he's seeing the Hebrew, which is almost basically a direct translation from the Egyptian glyphs. And then from there, the English is more flexible, although it is just there. Sometimes it's not there and he's got to go find it. There are places where he says he has to go consult with people about it. And so it's certainly not giving him just straight out sentences all the time. But so he reads it, he comprehends it, and he puts it into sentences. The other people, I don't have anything in their record that gives me any insight into this particular Joseph Smith question. So then now I'd like to open the floor to let's keep it to just this one concept of, is it dictated or is it translated by their mind from an ancient idea into a modern wording? Any thoughts or questions or comments? Terry.
What is your definition of translation versus transcription?
I would think Well, I will start by saying that I'm not sure that my definition would change anything one way or the other on what I'm describing, but I would think of translation as you know the original language, and therefore you understand the original concept, and therefore when you put it into English, you're representing the original. And then transcription would be more like what Hava Pratt had, where it's being given to her and she's just getting mostly English, and it's coming out in well-formed English on our end. Is that a fair answer?
I agree with you.
Oh, sweet.
Therefore, I argue on the protagonist on the issue that Joseph did no translation because he did not know Reformed Egyptian or whatever. He saw or heard in vision and was told what to say, and he said that to the scribes. He didn't take Reformed Egyptian and make that into English. He was told or saw that in vision. Therefore, that's transcription. So I'll always stand forever on that and fight for it.
Fair enough. Phil? Phil, did you have a comment? Yeah, here you go.
I had to look for the hand. Anyway, I just want to read you something that I believe the Bible is also bears witness with everything else. And so, but anyway, I just want to read a short little passage here. It says in John 16, it's talking about the Holy Ghost. This is kind of neat. He says, Jesus is talking about this. I have yet many things to say unto you, but ye cannot bear them now. You've got time coming. He says, howbeit, when the Spirit of truth is come, present tense, he will guide you into all truth. For he shall not speak of himself, but whatsoever he shall hear, that shall he speak. And he will show you things to come. He shall glorify me, for he shall receive of mine, and shall show it unto you. And I think the Holy Ghost is involved in all of this. I think how it comes and all those different things, we can get a lot of people scratching their heads. Well, how are we doing this? But what shall we know except that the Spirit of truth is amongst us? And that's what the whole thing's about. Jesus knew that. He knew, I can't tell you everything now. There's a place in the Bible that says there should have been many books written about Jesus that are not there. But they should have been. But the thing is they were not given at that time all at once. It came coming in.
Yep.
And so I think that's just what I want to say.
All right. I'm going to jump to the next question. So I can't see people that are holding up their hands, but I can see if you raise your hand in the app. So if there's anybody holding up their hands, you guys will have to point it out to me. But we're going to jump to the next one. So there's these quotings of passages from the Bible that occur quite heavily, Isaiah. But one of the questions that people ask or accuse Joseph of is cheating and just using the Bible. And I've thought a fair amount on this, because I know when I'm translating the Tao Te Ching, the very first thing I do is go cheat because I got to start by wrapping my head around what other people think. So I don't necessarily think that it's cheating if Joseph did just go take the Bible and compare. That doesn't seem wrong to me, as long as he's comparing it. And when there's differences, he tells me. I don't really care if he was able to come up with King James Bible. But so this is one of the questions: was Joseph cheating as like a crutch? And so let's look into that. So Mauricio Berger makes some comments on that exact thing. He says, since the interpreters connect with the mental concept in the translator's mind in order to create meaning, so if the translator is familiar a passage in the Bible, his mind immediately connects the wording in a way that is familiar to the translator. This phenomenon is not even intentional, is the way that he describes it. And this goes along with what we've talked about a couple of different times. I want to say, is it James that presented on this? Where there's these other records that are floating, other books that are floating around at the time of Joseph Smith, and he's drawing on lots of phrasing and things from these books. And it's because, or at least the way that Mauricio is describing it, it's because those are phrases that make sense to him in his mind in the translation process. The way that the interpreters work, they connect not with words, but with places in your mind that hold those words. And that's what comes out. That's what he seems to be describing. So one thing that happened here, so with David Ferriman in Zenos chapter 10, this is Jacob chapter 5, or whatever it is in the authorized version. But so the allegory chapter, which is not short. David just said, you know what? Let's open them up side by side. And I'm going to compare. And if it's different, then I will make note, but I'm not going to translate this behemoth of a thing that I assume is right. It's already right. And so what you'll find if you compare those is that at the very beginning, kind of the introductory verses have some difference, because Jacob is doing the quick intro of the vision and Zenos has his intro of the vision. And then at the end, it wraps it up on the other end a little different, but it on the inside, it's basically the same, which is what you would expect if Jacob copied it down verbatim and Joseph translated his verbatim and the English was reasonable that Joseph came up with, then it's gonna match for David. So why not cheat? So in other areas though, and this is also with David, in other areas that do have significant overlap, he translated them in the non-cheating way because he wanted to compare them himself to see that it was indeed following it, because he almost kind of like wanted his own testimony from the Lord that it's working. Because if he gets it from the plates and then goes and compares it to a place that he knows is similar, he's like, oh my word, this is the same. So I say all of that to say that there's no reason to believe one way or the other whether or not Joseph cheated. Also with Matthew Gill, I don't know of any comments that he's made, but there are passages where he has things like the Sermon on the Mount and the creation account where there's significant overlaps. And I have no idea if he just, if his translation is just to read them from the old text, I don't know why you would go get another text to compare, but he certainly could have. But I don't have any insight into that. So I just want to point out that with Joseph Smith, we do have eyewitnesses, but we don't really have one eyewitness that says, I watched the entire translation and I can tell you everything that happened and anything I don't say didn't happen, right? We have no way of knowing whether or not the pieces that we have are a complete picture. And so even though it doesn't sound like that from the various sources that we have, I don't think that means that he didn't compare it to the Bible. I don't see any reason that it needs to be blind. But so that's my thoughts on this one. Does anybody else have thoughts on this? I'll call it the cheating translators phenomenon. No? Okay, I'm going to jump to the next one. So then scribal influence. How much influence does a scribe have? So with Matthew Gill, he's got two scribes. They're editors of the final draft. And so they kind of do have some responsibility in making sure that what ends up is what was translated. And I feel like that's the same thing that happened with Joseph, where his scribe was generally the better scholastically educated person in the room. So they're having an influence on the draft, but probably not the content. That with Mauricio, he's got his two scribes, one in each language. I imagine that his English scribe is fixing his English on a regular basis because his English is not fluent. With Philip Landis, he doesn't really have a scribe, but he has his translation council, and there were areas of the translation where he says that they went through several, like they would roll back several chapters and re-edit because a thing that they had been trying to negotiate what's the best way to do, they would find out later that it really was better the way that one of the other was talking about, and they just didn't stand their ground, I guess, because they're peaceful people. But so the scribes do have an influence on the end result, but that's the way that it seems to me. Are there any thoughts on this before we jump to the next one? Okay, so exact wording. So in the Articles of the Faith in the LDS tradition, one of the Articles of Faith says that we believe the Bible to be the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly. But we also believe the Book of Mormon to be the Word of God. And then it leaves out that phrase, translated correctly, which if you're in the inerrant camp of Christianity where the Word of God is inerrant, that article of faith kind of implies that the Bible's allowed to have the occasional mistake, even though it's basically right, but that the Book of Mormon is now inerrant, right? That's an easy way to translate that or to receive that article of faith. And so I wondered about that my whole life. I always viewed the Book of Mormon as like the revealed truth. And so you can't disagree with that. It can't be mistaken. But is the translation beyond reproach? And that is the question that we should ask ourselves. I think that at some point, everybody kind of asks this, how much can I trust this to be perfectly accurate? So Mauricio commented on this. He says that for many of the symbols, multiple words are suggested by the interpreter stones, and he just decides which one am I going to use. He is at liberty to choose whichever one make the most sense to him as the translator. And so if there could have been a more accurate term, we didn't get it. And that's okay. That's the way that the translation works. So I know that I've suggested wording changes to David in the Book of Noon. And after thinking through and praying about him, he said, yeah, I'm going to go with that because that's an easier read. It matches up with other things that are the same content. I like that translation. So we'll switch it. I think we changed the word gift to treasure in one spot because I was like, well, it seems more in line with other places that talk about treasures. And he's like, that seems like perfectly reasonable. So in no way was the word received the only option. So we also know that Joseph Smith modified various places. The most famous, I think, is the place where he adds the son of the eternal Father in First Nephi, where the son of was added after the initial publication. Now, I've always assumed that that just meant that, his scribe didn't do a good job. But it turns out that there is a place in the book of Zenos that has almost verbatim the same phrase, the same verse as what's in Nephi. And in the Zenos record, it says, and an angel said unto me, behold, the Lamb of God, or the Lamb of the Lord, yea, even the eternal Father. It doesn't include the phrase, the son of, which is the phrase that was added after the fact by Joseph because he thought that he'd made a mistake. Now, I'm not so much worried about the mistake here as I'm thinking that is evidence that the original record that Joseph received may well have said even the eternal Father and didn't include the phrase the son of. And theologically, Joseph's like, that's not right. And so he doubted his translation because he didn't consider it to be inerrant. He could see that it was not quite what he thought it should be. It just is interesting to me that it turns out that his original translation may well have been right, at least in terms of being true to the record. And I got one more slide before I jump to questions. So Moroni also recognized that same potential. He says, if there be faults, they be the faults of a man. That's in Mormon 4 or 8. And now this to me says that Moroni, having been a translator of ancient records himself, is looking at it thinking, I may well have messed up here. Because he knows that there's a human element in this translation process. And every time I've approached one of these translators about something awkward in the translation, without fail, every one of them I don't know why this would be hard to say. Every one of them immediately assumed that they are a terrible translator. Or at least that if there was a flaw, it was their fault. And they wanted to know so that they could go in and figure it out and fix it, because they're supposed to get it right. And they're very definitely human, and that the record itself is not infallible. It's only amazing. So yeah, Phil, you have a thought?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, what's coming to me is this, is that we're asked in Little John in the Bible, towards Revelation, we find, and in 4, it talks about trying the spirits, so you know what sort they are of. I don't think Joseph Smith was cheating or any of those things, but it sure is nice to have a witness. It's wonderful to be able to feel the witness of the Holy Spirit move, and also, and I have found in different places where you kind of wonder if it is or not. And I'll tell you something, this between you guys, I speak in tongues and also prophesy. But the thing is one day my wife and I, we were talking, we're praying, and all of a sudden I spoke in a language that it sounded like a language that come from outer space. And 5 years later, a tribe came on TV speaking that language. And it had clicks in it. Every word it said, clack, the tongue would go, clack, clack, clack. And I go, whoa. Now why? And the reason was that that happened is basically we're growing and need to grow. And that's how we grow, is when the Spirit makes intercession with us and makes these things come alive. I can see people wondering, yeah, I don't want to make a mistake.
Yeah.
And you got to turn around, you got to give your heart to Jesus and all the way in this, or you're going to always be wondering if you're making a mistake.
Yeah. There's this huge responsibility to get it right. And if there's any potential, you're just like, oh man, I've done it wrong. Right? Val, what are your thoughts?
So a couple of things you said, like you talked about the guy who kind of worked his memory, and he could feel the Spirit kind of searching his memory for words and so forth. And then and that's suggesting that the lexicon of the translator and the sort of store of language they have is what is used to produce the text. And that the thing you just said a minute ago goes along with that too. This idea that they would correct a translation, that doesn't fit very well with what I gather is Terry's theory. Of course, none of this has to be what Joseph Smith did. So, but if this does say something about how Joseph Smith translated, what you're describing fits better with what Jim Lucas, his approach to translation, because if it's just you're just reading off a text, I guess some of the ones you had, it was just maybe reading off the text that appears.
Yeah.
But when people are making changes, that doesn't fit with the reading the text. If you're just reading the text, where's the room for a change?
Yeah.
people, because you misread it. I mean, it's like, how hard is it to read off of a text? So you've kind of got strands of the two different theories of translation, like the one Terry's embracing and the one Jim's embracing. You're kind of mentioning things that go along with both those. I don't know if we resolved the issue, but at least the things you were saying most recently go along more with Jim's theory of translation.
Yeah, I don't know that it resolves it, but I do think that for either one, whichever camp you'd like to be in for these, it gives you something to kind of mix into that and ask, is that what was going on? And if so, do I get new understanding of that by looking at what these guys are saying they experienced? But I think it's a fascinating question is what it is. Paul, you want to share?
Yes, I would like to commend you on a tremendous job of treating people with equity and recognizing the genius of what they are doing, because it's so easy to find fault and be able to give that priority. But by seeking the commonalities, you have adopted the fundamental premise of the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum, and I deeply appreciate the demonstration that you've made here with these 10 presentations to highlight that there's an awful lot that we have to learn. And I think for most of us, we're not that well acquainted with these more modern translations or transcriptions to know enough about them to be able to even make good comment. Yet I am aware that in some cases we've had some very critical comments, and so to have you be able to address the commonalities and treat them equitably is for me a very, very satisfying approach. And thank you very much for volunteering and giving this the rather exotic presentation.
Well, thanks. Terry, do you want to share your thoughts?
I appreciate what you've done too. It's quite interesting. My background is archaeology, and to me, understanding people is what you understand from them physically from the ground. You're understanding people, and I think a lot of the corrections that take place in the Bible and the Book of Mormon have to do with understanding the cultural setting in which that was given. Right or wrong, to me, that's an important consideration. So I thank you for what you've done.
This is Kenneth. One of the things I think of is the no erasers would kind of say that he did it word for word, to where if it was him guessing at the things or something or with that, well, then why would he say something and then correct himself in the no eraser?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I do know that I don't know enough about the Joseph Smith translation to know if we have the original record or only the printer manuscript, and if there were cross throughs and reworks. Like, I don't know. I know that the people who we have testimony from, I'm not calling them liars or anything at all along that, but I think that they all want to share. To them, it's this prophet and it's this amazing thing, and they want to share it like it's the most amazing thing. There's this internal need for it to have been perfect. And I don't have any particular thing that I don't believe from the historical record, but I don't know that it's irrefutable. I mean, it's very possible that they edited it, and it wouldn't bother me at all because I love what I got out of their edit if they did, right? So I try not to worry too much about it, because if it turns out that we get new information that says that it was different than what we have wanted to believe our whole life, then that's fine, because the process to me isn't what is bringing me value, right? So I'm less worried about that, although I do enjoy the conversation about it.
I would highlight that
the one.
highlight, please, that Joseph Smith did edit the 1840 edition of the Book of Mormon, and Ebenezer Robinson took that to Cincinnati. He had the edited copy in his pocket to make sure that the corrections that Joseph wanted were made. And so the front piece on that edition shows that this is the corrected edition edited by Joseph Smith.
Yeah. Well, the no eraser I'm kind of talking about is that there's one in Alma, chapter 14 of the RLDS one, where it says weapons of peace. There is no such thing. Then he corrects it, he says, but he turns around and says weapons of war for peace, and makes that correction. Well, that's kind of what I was referring to. If it wasn't word for word, well, then why would that be in there?
Yeah. My personal opinion on that little passage is that Moroni has got his stylus or whatever it is that you etch into metal with, and he wrote down their weapons of peace because it takes longer to write than his brain goes. And he was gonna say war for peace, and he whoops, and he just fixed it. I think it was an ancient typo, but that's just my take on that. I don't have any reason to believe that. I like that story.
It should be interesting to all of you next week. We have the comparison, the detailed comparison coming from Stan Troe that will allow the juxtaposition of books for purposes of the comparison of the actual changes. Far more detailed than anybody else has done to my knowledge.
All right, I think we can still get through the last couple of phenomenons here. So one of the phenomenon that I can see recurring in these is that they're interacting with the original authors. So Joseph Smith meets Moroni back and forth for 4 years on the Hill Cumorah. There are accounts of him explaining to other people about different prophets, like he knows Nephi and he knows Paul, and like he's had these conversations with people. And you see the same thing. Mauricio, he says that he had interviews with Moroni for 10 years before he was given the plates. And Matthew Gill, he was set apart by Jeranek before he brought forth the record and told that this is my record that you're going to be bringing forth. And Philip Landis, he's having conversations with almost, I don't know almost all, I know that it's a regular thing for him to be talking to the author while he's doing the translating. And I think it's a fascinating idea that these angelic beings are involved in their own records coming forth, and it's kind of a recurring theme, and it's an inspiring theme. But so, any thoughts on that before I jump to the next one? We're pretty close to the end, I promise. Okay, so then we have these linguistic anachronisms. Joseph Smith using words like steel and crucified, and these are not things that existed in 700 BC Judaism, right? So Mauricio commented on this. Now I fully understand why some anachronisms exist in the Book of Mormon, like the word steel, which is so commonly used by critics of Joseph Smith Jr., since this word could not exist in the records of the people who lived before the world produced steel. Certainly, among the many words that appeared through the interpreting stones for Joseph to choose to describe the bow of Nephi while translating the Book of Mormon, steel was selected by Joseph to portray then a word non-existent in the 19th century to describe the metal alloy described in the original Nephite record, but which would be a dead word for the reader. So he's saying that the book had a word that doesn't have an English translation because it was an alloy, and in Joseph's mapping, it was steelish. But that Mauricio feels like it was just as it's connecting to whatever the word is in your mind that files away this idea, that's the word that the translating stones give you. Joseph also used the word crucified, which was not a thing in ancient Judaism at the time. But when Nephi says that he would be crucified according to the words of Num. Now, in Num, chapter 4, verse 29 from the plates of brass, it says, 3 share their fates when he is crucified. And she used the word crucified. So when David was translating Num, the word that was there was more like executed or hanged. But since Num witnessed this event, she knew what crucifixion was, and she wrote down the word that worked. And to the translator, it says crucified. And to Nephi, who also saw, it said crucified. So it's not as anachronistic as you would think, even though archaeologically speaking, there's no way that Num recorded the word crucified, right? Any thoughts on that phenomenon? Dave?
I'd say that's pretty powerful explanation, actually, of the anachronistic. If you grant that people have visions of what happens in the future and that they're recording a vision of what happens, then the more accurate way to translate it ultimately is to turn it into the language of the modern reader that replicates what they saw. So yeah, that's a pretty good explanation. Okay.
Dave, did you have a thought?
I was gonna say exactly what happened, but he basically just described what happened, so I don't need to say anything. Thank you.
All right, open discussion. Does anybody have any thoughts on the whole thing or related things?
I'd like to just briefly go back to what I was kind of getting into in the discussions of the Dr. Landis, and didn't realize that I was jumping into the middle of the discussion. So one aspect that's significant about Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Mormon was that they put out, was it 5,000 copies in the first printing? And he, sent out missionaries right away to spread the Book of Mormon. And that was, in some respects, the primary activity of the early church in the 1830s and then on, right down to the current day. All of the sort of, if you will, existing large restoration churches, the Church of Jesus Christ, the Community of Christ, the LDS Church, are pretty active proselyting organizations, engage in fairly active proselyting, which, traces it right back to the 1830, when they produced lots of copies of the Book of Mormon. And basically everybody who was in the movement at that time, all 100 or so people, all went off and immediately started missionizing. So I guess the question I have is, all of these different, well, I guess we have to put the Sister Buffington, the hymn revelator, in the Church of Jesus Christ of the Monongahela movement. That she kind of seems to be in a different category than the rest, but all of the rest, I'm just curious if have they, to print 5,000 copies in 1830 was, Martin Harris had to mortgage his farm. It was, a major financial investment. And then all of those early missionaries, was a vast time investment. So I guess, my question is, of all of these, leaving aside the question of the sister who wrote the hymns, because I kind of see her in a different category. But I mean, have any of the other groups that have produced these kinds of these translations, you know, made the investment to put out huge numbers of copies of these translations? Have they, you know, put in the effort to engage in this a huge proselyting outreach? Tried to immediately draw in large numbers of members and establish a church where all of the adult men were, you know, immediately put to work missionizing. I mean, it's a factual question.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
curious
there,
about that.
there
And
are
it could be very different answers for all the different groups, obviously.
sure. And they seem to have different emphasis and priorities. Some of them want to gather Zion, so they feel called to go kind of be in a place and be ready, but not to go find the people, just to have the place. Others, you don't have to you don't have to pay a printer to print a large volume in order to get an order printed anymore. And so because you can auto print, and so there's no reason to go mortgage your farm or to go to Martin Harris and say, you know, don't covet your own property because you don't have to. It can be available to as many people who want it on PDF as want it, and you can give them permission to go to whatever printing service and just print one out. I know that the Denver Snuffer group has taken their primary focus has been to put together like a collection of the things they consider scripture into a very pleasant printing, and it's available. But they didn't print a million copies. They print on demand, like most people do at this point. There's some of them do their missionary work by just being available when, I mean, this is especially true of the Denver Snuffer group, where as people become disenchanted with whatever group they're in, they're not disenchanted with the idea of being with other people in a religious setting. They just don't feel at home where they're at. And so they were very popular in this Utah area where there's a lot of people who don't know what to do with themselves anymore. And so then they're like, well, here's a group that believes basically what I believe and also believes that I'm allowed to believe whatever I want to believe, and they don't care. And so it's like an in between having a faith crisis and not having a faith crisis, because you still believe, you just don't know what you believe and you don't feel at home anymore. And so you work with these other groups. So in his largest period of time, I think there were a few thousand people that considered themselves part of his kind of loose group. But I don't know of any of the other ones that have been large, and they kind of fluctuate in size, but mostly they're just, it seems like the commonality is that they produce a record and they help make it available, and they accept people who want to be a part of the discussion on that. And that's kind of where most of them have landed, because it is very difficult to send people out into the world.
Brent, if you would please, if you'll stop the screen, share screen, then we can see each other better in the discussion.
That answers my question. I'll
you.
pass to Terry, who's had his hand up.
Yeah, Terry.
Hey, I'm going to throw out an idea that probably most of you have never heard. It's a supposition. Most of what we read in the Book of Mormon is an edited version of what Moroni wrote, or Mormon wrote. And so one can ask the question, okay, is what Nephi said in 550 BC Nephi's words, or is it Mormon's interpretation or editing of Nephi's words in 400 AD? I don't have an answer to that, none whatsoever. And so it doesn't matter, because what matters is the Book of Mormon as is what we are supposed to be obedient to and base our religion on. And that's what I do. And so I don't worry about some of these little innuendos and whatnot, because, you know, I take it at face value because I'm not smart enough to know better. So I just want to leave that with you.
Yeah. Read it for what it says and use Moroni's admonition to let it be true.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching 10 o'clock, and it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Brent, for so much work and for volunteering to present. I just find it delightful how people like you will somehow connect with us and help to open our minds to a whole bunch of additional ideas and set of perceptions that we have not previously considered. And so thank you again for that.
You're certainly welcome.
I would pause if there's any other questions or comments. There is one. David?
I'm curious, Grant. I'm really fascinated by the number of translators you've come up with, and I'm wondering how complete you feel this list is. Is this just a small subset of the number of people out there who are doing translations, or is this a fairly complete list? And as an aside, I know of one here near Lamoni, a fellow by the name of Ron Livingston has claimed to have translated the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. I know nothing about it other than that much. But I'm curious about how many more of them are out there like that.
There are more that I would personally consider part of, even on my bookshelf here, I have more that I'm sure came from an LDS tradition, but they no longer look to Joseph as a prophet. So I filtered them down to only people who would still consider themselves coming from that tradition. And anyone who has come out and said, I was a fraud, I threw those out. But anybody who's standing by their claim that they received this from the Lord, I left it in the list. And that's everybody that I'm aware of that I've read personally and that that I'm aware enough to share anything useful.
Thank you.
And David, too, the other David.
Yes, thank you. I really did enjoy this program tonight, and I just have one little request that I don't know if it could be worked out, but I would really like to have a continuation of this subject and go in a little bit more detail with some of these ones that he's mentioned tonight. I really did enjoy it, and I think there's a lot we can learn from it too.
So
that's not my cuckoo.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that whenever if you want to fill a week, as long as you give me some notice. We could pick one and share a couple of stories from it, or pick and kind of do a few from here and a few from that. I'm open to kind of whatever. This is a thing I'm fascinated in, so I'm happy to talk about it.
And by the way, the James J. Strang translated from the Plates of Laban, and he did use the Urim and Thummim.
Okay. Do we have any people commenting on, like, did he have scribes? Do we have people that commented on what that process looked like? Or
well, there was articles in the Gospel Herald and other newspaper articles that James put out to explain what, or to refer to as far as his translation, especially the notes, because he had to describe the notes because they were actually revelations that were given at the same time he was translating the commandments themselves in the book of the law.
Oh, okay. So the notes that are part of each chapter were part of translating, but they were received not from the plates, but like through the Urim and Thummim at the same time period.
They were through the Urim and Thummim, yes.
Okay.
But they were the translation was the commandments, and then the revelations were the notes that he received explaining what the commandments were.
All right. I'm glad you're here to share that, because that's one of the blank areas where I'm just like, I don't know. All right, Phil.
Yes,
there are several articles about that.
Phil?
I just want to say on our closing here is, the Bible says to try the spirits so we know what sort they are of. I think that's very important for us. But Joseph Smith also says the burning of your bosom now. How many's ever felt the burning of your bosom? About the different things that we're talking about. The Holy Spirit is alive and is real, and he's wants to talk to us. But that burning is his witness. And I think we ought to always put it before that, put it before the Holy Spirit and feel that burn. And then you'll know that you're on the right track.
Yep.
With that, then may the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord lift up his face to shine on you. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord lift up his face to shine on you and give you peace. Good night.